The morning the kingdom celebrated Duke Tristan Ashbourne's return from Parliament began beneath a sky the color of polished silver. Bells rang from church towers, carriage wheels echoed across rain-darkened streets, and noble families gathered inside Ashbourne Hall expecting speeches, music and another display of the Duke's calm wisdom. Few men in the realm commanded greater respect than Tristan. At 35, he possessed the steady judgment that had ended feuds without bloodshed, rescued struggling villages from famine, and earned the loyalty of both tenants and peers. Those who served him often said his greatest strength was not his title but his unwavering belief that justice must always stand above emotion. That belief would become the weapon used against him. Among those welcoming him stood Lord Cedric Wycliffe, Tristan's 40-year-old cousin. Cedric wore polished smiles as naturally as tailored coats, and no guest suspected the envy concealed beneath his flawless manners. For years he had watched Tristan inherit everything he desired: wealth, influence, respect, and above all, Lady Elara Ashbourne. Cedric had long ago concluded that a man unable to possess another's happiness should simply destroy it. While Tristan had governed counties, Cedric had quietly governed whispers, bribing servants, buying silence, and weaving lies so carefully that each one appeared stitched with truth. Lady Elara waited in the grand drawing room with one hand resting protectively over the child growing beneath her heart. At only 24, she carried herself with quiet grace rather than aristocratic pride. 7 months of pregnancy had softened her movements but strengthened her resolve. Every servant knew she remembered birthdays, visited sick tenants without ceremony, and often spent afternoons teaching orphan girls to read in the castle library. She had imagined greeting her husband with joyful news that the nursery was finally finished and the baby's tiny cradle stood beside the window overlooking the gardens. Instead, she found Tristan waiting in silence, a collection of letters spread across the polished oak table between them. The room felt strangely cold despite the fire burning nearby. Tristan lifted one folded page without meeting her eyes. "I received these during my journey home." Elara frowned gently. "What are they?" His jaw tightened. "Proof." She accepted the paper with trembling fingers. Every line accused her of secretly meeting another nobleman while Tristan served the crown. Hidden meetings. Promises of love. Plans to flee before the child was born. The handwriting resembled her own with frightening accuracy. Even the wax seals bore convincing impressions. She stared at the pages as though they belonged to another life entirely. "I never wrote these." The words came quietly, almost in disbelief. Tristan's gaze finally met hers, and what frightened her most was not anger. It was disappointment. "I wanted to believe that." She stepped closer, her breathing uneven. "You must believe it still." Another document appeared. Then another. Each seemed more convincing than the last. Witness statements. Servants claiming they had seen secret meetings. A stable hand swearing another gentleman had visited after midnight. Every accusation had been prepared long before Tristan returned. Every lie waited patiently for this single afternoon. Elara searched desperately for the husband who had once laughed beside her beneath spring blossoms, but his expression remained carved from stone. "I have never betrayed you," she whispered. "I have never stopped loving you." For several endless seconds neither spoke. Outside, rain began tapping against tall windows. Inside, the silence became unbearable. At last Tristan drew a slow breath. "If these accusations become public, Parliament will demand your imprisonment. The Ashbourne name will become another scandal whispered across every county." She stared at him. "You think exile is mercy?" "I think prison would destroy what little dignity remains." Her hand instinctively covered her unborn child. "Our son has done nothing." "Our child deserves peace," Tristan answered, though every word sounded heavier than the last. "Away from courts, away from public disgrace." He reached inside a polished wooden box resting beside the letters. Instead of jewels, he withdrew a rusted iron key blackened by age. He placed it gently upon the table. The ancient metal seemed strangely out of place among silver candle holders and polished marble. Then came a folded legal document bearing the Ashbourne seal. The deed to Black Hollow Estate. Elara's face drained of color. Everyone in the kingdom knew Black Hollow. Children frightened one another with stories of its abandoned halls. Harvests supposedly failed there. Families vanished. Servants refused employment even for generous wages. People claimed the estate itself rejected anyone foolish enough to call it home. "You cannot send us there." "I already have." His voice remained painfully calm. "The property now belongs to you." Tears blurred her vision. "There must be another way." He looked toward the rain-covered windows instead of her face. This decision is final. She walked slowly around the table until only a step separated them. The child shifted beneath her heart as though sensing her fear. "If you no longer trust me," she whispered, "then look at me only once, not as your duchess, not as the woman these letters describe, but as the wife who has loved you every day since we first met." For the briefest heartbeat, uncertainty flickered across Tristan's eyes. It disappeared almost immediately. He stepped backward. "I have arranged a carriage." Those words shattered whatever hope remained. By sunset, servants loaded only her simplest belongings. Expensive furniture, family portraits, treasured books, and even the baby's cradle remained inside Ashbourne Hall. Several servants quietly turned away, unable to watch, while others obeyed without expression. One maid secretly tucked a knitted baby blanket into Elara's trunk before wiping away tears. Cedric observed everything from an upper balcony, hiding satisfaction behind solemn sympathy as thunder rolled across the darkening sky. The carriage climbed lonely roads through relentless rain until the kingdom itself seemed to disappear behind curtains of mist. Dead orchards stretched across abandoned hillsides. Empty sheep fields lay swallowed by weeds. A shattered greenhouse leaned against broken stone walls, while the roof of the once magnificent manor sagged beneath decades of neglect. Ivy consumed cracked towers, windows gaped like empty eyes, and rusted gates groaned as though protesting her arrival. The coachman unloaded her trunk without speaking. The remaining servants refused even to cross the threshold. One elderly footman glanced toward the silent mansion before quietly muttering, "Even ghosts abandon this place." Moments later, the carriage vanished into the rain, leaving Elara standing alone before the enormous ruined hall. She unlocked the great doors with the rusted key, lit a single trembling candle against the swallowing darkness, rested both hands over her unborn son, and whispered through tears, "If the whole world has abandoned us, then, my little one, we must teach this forgotten place how to live again." 2 months passed beneath relentless labor instead of hopelessness. Every sunrise found Elara sweeping ruined corridors, patching broken windows with salvaged boards, and carrying buckets through leaking hallways before exhaustion forced her to rest. Black Hollow remained cold and wounded, yet each small repair felt like a promise whispered to the child she still carried. Mrs. Agnes Rowan visited whenever weather allowed, bringing coarse bread, herbs, and practical wisdom earned through decades of hardship. She never spoke about curses. She spoke about roofs, gardens, and surviving winters. Slowly, the abandoned estate stopped feeling like a tomb and began resembling a home waiting to awaken. Then autumn unleashed its fury. One violent night, thunder rolled across the hills with such force that ancient walls trembled. Rain hammered the roof, wind ripped loose cracked shutters, and lightning split the tallest chimney, sending stones crashing into the courtyard below. Elara doubled over beside the fireplace as sharp pain stole her breath. The child was coming far too soon. Every road disappeared beneath rising floodwater. No physician could reach Black Hollow. No carriage could leave. Agnes arrived soaked to the bone after walking through the storm carrying only a lantern, clean linen, and fearless determination. She looked once at Elara's frightened face before placing both weathered hands around hers. "You are stronger than this night," she said quietly. Hours stretched endlessly. The wind screamed through broken towers. Candles guttered. The old manor seemed determined to surrender to the storm, but neither woman allowed fear to rule the room. Agnes guided every breath while Elara clung to hope with trembling resolve. Just before dawn, the tiny child entered the world. Silence followed. The baby neither cried nor opened his eyes. His chest barely moved. Agnes wrapped him carefully and lowered her head, unable to hide the sorrow gathering behind her calm expression. Even she believed the fragile little life would vanish before sunrise. Elara refused that ending. She settled beside the fire, holding her son against her heartbeat beneath layers of warm blankets. Instead of pleading for miracles, she began telling stories. She described orchards heavy with apples, fields bright with wildflowers, birds greeting every dawn, and a father whose smile she prayed the boy might someday know. Her voice remained steady even while tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Hour after hour she spoke until the first pale light entered the room. Then a faint cry broke the silence. "Small. Weak. Beautiful." The child inhaled. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers. Agnes laughed through grateful tears. "He has chosen life." Elara kissed the baby's forehead. "Then his name shall be Rowan." The weeks that followed tested every promise she had made beside that fire. Rowan survived, but only barely. His lungs struggled with every cold morning. Fever visited often. He remained so small that strangers guessed he was months younger than he truly was. When other infants learned to crawl, Rowan tired after only a few uncertain movements. Each setback pierced Elara's heart, yet every sunrise found her beginning again. She sold the last symbols of her former life without hesitation. Her wedding necklace disappeared first. Elegant bracelets followed. Finally she parted with the jeweled brooch her mother had given her on her wedding day. The money purchased medicine, blankets, nourishing food, and one visit from a traveling physician willing to brave Black Hollow despite its fearful reputation. The elderly doctor examined Rowan with gentle patience before turning toward Elara. "He needs clean air," he said. "Fresh milk, honest food, and hope. Without those, medicine alone cannot save him." Those words changed everything. The following morning Elara rose before dawn and walked to an abandoned pasture where two neglected Jersey cows wandered among weeds. She persuaded their aging owner to sell them cheaply in exchange for restoring his collapsed fence. Her hands blistered learning to milk them, but Rowan drank every precious drop. She rescued abandoned lambs left to perish after spring markets failed and bottle-fed them beside her son. Their quiet company filled lonely afternoons with unexpected comfort. Soon vegetables replaced weeds in forgotten gardens. Apple saplings lined the empty orchard. Lavender softened cracked pathways with color and fragrance. Chickens wandered freely through rebuilt pens, providing fresh eggs for neighboring widows as well as the manor kitchen. Elara kneaded bread before sunrise, filling silent halls with warm scents instead of dust. Every improvement, however humble, declared that despair would no longer own Black Hollow. Word spread beyond the hills. Curious villagers cautiously approached the estate expecting ghosts and found kindness instead. Elara welcomed hungry children with bowls of steaming soup. She opened the neglected library each afternoon, teaching letters to youngsters whose families could not afford tutors. She accepted no payment beyond laughter and willingness to learn. Parents who once feared the cursed grounds now crossed its gates carrying baskets of seeds, timber, and friendship. Former servants began returning one by one. None were summoned. Each arrived because hope had become stronger than superstition. Together they repaired roofs, restored stables, cleared tangled orchards, and rebuilt the shattered greenhouse pane by pane. Sunlight finally reached corners untouched for decades. Birds nested beneath repaired eaves. Wild roses climbed old stone walls where ivy alone had ruled before. Rowan watched everything from a woven basket near the gardens until he grew strong enough to stand holding the fence. Though still smaller than children his age, laughter replaced many of his tears. His cheeks slowly gained color. He chased butterflies with uncertain steps, stopping often to catch his breath, yet always rising again after every stumble. One golden evening, Elara carried him beneath the youngest apple tree she had planted with her own hands. Its branches remained thin, but tiny blossoms had appeared despite the harsh land that surrounded it. Rowan reached toward the flowers and laughed with pure delight. As Elara lifted her eyes, she noticed riders paused on the distant ridge overlooking Black Hollow. They remained only moments before disappearing into the fading light. 5 years transformed Black Hollow so completely that travelers often believed they had taken the wrong road. The same hills once wrapped in silence now shimmered beneath endless rows of apple trees whose branches bent beneath crimson fruit. The dead orchards had become fragrant gardens alive with bees, butterflies, and singing birds. Sheep grazed peacefully across emerald pastures where weeds had once swallowed forgotten fields. Crystal streams turned newly built watermills, their steady rhythm echoing across the valley like the heartbeat of a place reborn. Every sunrise painted the restored manor in warm gold instead of lonely gray, and the estate once feared throughout the kingdom had quietly become its greatest miracle. The change had never happened through sudden fortune. It had been earned one sunrise at a time. Elara still rose before dawn every morning, though servants now begged her to rest more often. She refused to abandon the habits that had saved both her life and her son's. She milked the Jersey cows alongside dairymaids, inspected the orchards with experienced gardeners, and walked through the vegetable fields greeting every worker by name. Noble birth had never prevented her from labor, and 5 difficult years had erased whatever distance once separated mistress from servant. Those who worked beside her loved her not because she owned the estate but because she carried baskets, planted trees, and shared meals exactly as they did. Mrs. Agnes Rowan, her silver hair brighter than ever beneath the morning sun, watched those scenes with quiet satisfaction. She often joked that Black Hollow had cured everyone except her aching knees. The villagers laughed because they knew it was almost true. Families who once planned to leave the valley forever had built new cottages instead. Empty barns overflowed with grain. Children no longer feared the abandoned manor. They raced through its gardens chasing butterflies, their laughter replacing every ghost story whispered by previous generations. Little Rowan Ashbourne had grown stronger with each passing season. Though still smaller than many boys his age, his bright blue eyes held endless curiosity, and his smile carried a warmth that reminded older villagers of spring after a bitter winter. He loved every creature that wandered the estate. Injured birds found refuge in his careful hands. Lost lambs followed him across meadows as though recognizing an old friend. He knew every stable horse by name and insisted on thanking each cow after morning milking, believing kindness should never depend upon whether someone could answer. "The animals work for us," he often told the stable hands with complete seriousness. "So we must thank them." Even the hardest laborers found themselves smiling. Every Sunday the restored courtyard filled with music instead of silence. Local musicians gathered beneath flowering trees while farmers displayed cheeses, bread, honey, fresh vegetables, woven blankets, and carved furniture throughout the bustling market square that had once been nothing more than cracked stone. Visitors arrived from neighboring counties carrying empty wagons and returned home with produce, livestock, and stories too wonderful for many listeners to believe. Before long people stopped calling Black Hollow the cursed estate. A new name spread naturally from village to village. They called it the Miracle Estate. Far beyond those peaceful hills, Duke Tristan Ashbourne heard the rumors repeatedly. Merchants praised impossible harvests. Traveling judges spoke of remarkable schools for poor children. Clergymen admired generous soup kitchens serving anyone who arrived hungry. One elderly magistrate even claimed the abandoned estate had become the happiest place in the county. Tristan dismissed each tale as hopeful exaggeration until nearly every conversation seemed to return to Black Hollow. At last curiosity overcame pride. Without announcing his intentions, Tristan saddled his favorite horse before dawn and rode toward the estate alone. The familiar road stirred memories he had spent years trying to bury. Rain had fallen on the day he left Elara there. He remembered refusing to look back despite hearing her voice one final time. Since then he had convinced himself exile had been the only honorable choice. Yet the closer he came to Black Hollow, the more uncertain that certainty became. The rusted iron gate stood open. Wild roses climbed the ancient stone pillars. Children skipped rope beside the entrance where frightened servants had once abandoned Elara's luggage. Fresh flowers overflowed from window boxes beneath every restored window. The shattered greenhouse gleamed beneath sunlight, filled with thriving vines and bright blossoms visible through sparkling glass. Smoke curled gently from repaired chimneys carrying the comforting scent of fresh bread instead of damp decay. Tristan slowed his horse. Nothing resembled the place he remembered. Farmers greeted one another with cheerful waves. Women carried baskets overflowing with apples. Blacksmiths laughed while repairing wagon wheels. A school bell rang across the courtyard, followed by delighted voices reciting lessons. Everywhere he looked, life flourished where death had once been expected. He dismounted almost without realizing it. A stable boy hurried forward. "Welcome, sir. Would you like water for your horse?" The child's easy confidence startled him more than any ruined tower ever could. "Thank you," Tristan replied quietly. He walked through the estate almost unnoticed, studying every careful improvement. The cracked fountain in the central garden flowed again, surrounded by lavender planted in graceful circles. The neglected nursery visible through an upstairs window had become bright with painted toys and handmade quilts. He paused beside the greenhouse where workers harvested tomatoes, herbs, and figs while laughing together. Every restored wall seemed to ask the same silent question. How had one abandoned woman accomplished all this? Then laughter drifted across the orchard. A small boy raced between rows of apple trees carrying a wooden basket almost too large for him. Golden sunlight danced across his tousled brown hair as he chased an escaping puppy through the grass. His laughter echoed freely until one careless step caught an exposed tree root. The basket flew from his hands. Apples scattered across the ground. The little boy stumbled forward. Without thinking, Tristan lunged. Strong hands caught the child before he struck the earth. For a heartbeat they simply looked at one another. The boy blinked in surprise before breaking into a brilliant smile that seemed impossibly familiar. "Thank you, Father." The word struck Tristan harder than any sword. His breath caught. His hands trembled slightly around the laughing child. Before either could speak again, hurried footsteps approached through the orchard. Elara emerged between flowering apple trees carrying a watering can, then stopped so suddenly that water spilled unnoticed onto the grass. 5 years disappeared inside a single silent moment. Tristan stood frozen beside the son he had never known, while Rowan looked happily between them, completely unaware that the simple word he had spoken had just shattered the carefully built certainty both of his parents had carried since the day the rusted key changed all their lives. The orchard remained silent long after Rowan's innocent greeting faded into the afternoon breeze. Tristan slowly released the boy, unable to look away from the familiar eyes staring back at him. They were Elara's eyes, bright with compassion, yet the shape of the child's smile belonged unmistakably to the Ashbourne family. Rowan simply bent to gather the fallen apples, humming happily as though nothing extraordinary had happened. To him, kindness deserved trust, and the stranger who had caught him from falling seemed worthy of the warm title he had spoken without thought. Elara reached them a heartbeat later. She steadied herself before speaking, refusing to let old wounds steal her composure. "Rowan," she said gently, "thank the gentleman properly." The little boy bowed with surprising seriousness. "Thank you, sir." Tristan swallowed hard. "You already thanked me." Rowan smiled again before racing after the playful puppy disappearing between the apple trees. His laughter drifted farther into the orchard until only birdsong remained. Tristan and Elara stood facing one another beneath branches heavy with fruit neither of them had imagined would ever exist on this forgotten land. "I never expected you to come," Elara said quietly. "I never expected to find this." His gaze wandered across the flourishing estate visible beyond the orchard. "I thought Black Hollow would have destroyed you." She looked toward the restored manor. "It nearly did." Neither mentioned the years between them. Neither mentioned the forged letters. The silence itself carried those memories. Before leaving that evening, Tristan requested permission to walk through the estate. Elara agreed without warmth or bitterness. She simply nodded and returned to her work, allowing the land she had rebuilt to answer questions she no longer wished to explain. Every corner unsettled him. The abandoned greenhouse overflowed with vegetables feeding hundreds of families. The once empty library echoed with children reading aloud. The old ballroom had become a weaving hall where widows earned honest wages. Former ruins had become workshops, classrooms, dairies, orchards, and homes. Nothing reflected pride. Everything reflected purpose. As sunset painted the valley in gold, Mrs. Agnes Rowan approached carrying a basket of fresh bread. "You've changed," she observed. "So has this place." Agnes smiled faintly. "No." She shook her head. "This place became what it always could have been." Her eyes rested on Tristan with quiet understanding. "The people changed." Those words followed him all the way back to Ashbourne Hall. Sleep refused to come. Again and again he remembered Elara standing beside broken gates 5 years earlier, one hand protecting their unborn child while rain concealed her tears. He remembered refusing to turn around. For the first time since that day, doubt entered his heart with terrifying force. The following morning Tristan unlocked the estate archives hidden beneath Ashbourne Hall. Dust-covered shelves filled with ledgers, correspondence, and legal records stretching back generations. Alone beneath flickering lantern light, he searched every document connected to Elara's exile. Hours passed. Then something impossible appeared. A registry listed 2 letters supposedly delivered from Elara during the same week Tristan had been attending Parliament. One courier's signature matched. The other belonged to a messenger who had died nearly 3 months earlier. Tristan stared at the page. Someone had forged official records. He searched further. Servant payroll books revealed unexplained payments made from Cedric's private accounts shortly before witnesses accused Elara. Stable records listed horses that never existed. Household expense ledgers contained unusual withdrawals disguised as maintenance costs. Piece by piece, certainty crumbled. He summoned the former stable master, now retired. The old man hesitated before speaking. "My lord, I feared no one would ever ask. What truly happened?" The servant lowered his eyes. "We were paid to lie." The word struck harder than any confession Tristan had ever heard. "Who paid you?" "Lord Cedric." The old man described everything with visible shame. False witness statements. Forged letters copied by hired scribes. Servants bribed into repeating rehearsed stories. Messengers intercepted before genuine correspondence reached the Duke. Every accusation against Elara had been carefully manufactured. Every defense had been deliberately erased. Tristan felt physically ill. He had sentenced the woman he loved without ever allowing her to defend herself. Still one question remained unanswered. What? The answer arrived unexpectedly when county surveyors requested permission to inspect land bordering Black Hollow. Curious, Tristan demanded their original reports from 5 years earlier. The maps revealed hidden mineral deposits beneath nearby hills. Gold. significant enough to transform the surrounding valley into one of the kingdom's richest properties. Cedric had known. Black Hollow had never been worthless. If Elara abandoned the estate or died there, ownership would eventually return to the Ashbourne inheritance, placing control within Cedric's reach. Instead, Elara had unknowingly increased its value far beyond buried treasure. Her orchards, mills, farms, schools, and markets had already made Black Hollow prosperous before a single ounce of gold had ever been touched. Cedric's greed had failed because compassion proved more valuable than wealth. Realizing exposure had become inevitable, Cedric chose desperation over surrender. The annual harvest festival drew hundreds of villagers to Black Hollow. Lanterns hung from apple trees. Music filled the evening air. Children danced across the courtyard while families shared bread baked from the year's finest wheat. Hidden beyond the celebrations, Cedric slipped into the largest grain barn carrying a lantern soaked in lamp oil. Flames spread with terrifying speed. Within moments, thick smoke swallowed the building. Panic erupted. Someone screamed that children remained inside. Without hesitation, Tristan ran toward the burning barn. Heat slammed into him as blazing beams crashed overhead. Through choking smoke, he found frightened children trapped behind collapsed grain sacks. He lifted two beneath his arms while urging the others toward the doorway. Outside, Elara ignored every desperate warning. She rushed inside carrying soaked blankets gathered from nearby water troughs. Together they searched room after room, refusing to leave until every terrified child had been found. Smoke burned their lungs. Falling timber blocked their escape more than once. Villagers formed desperate lines passing buckets while Agnes comforted weeping families waiting beyond the flames. At last the final child emerged safely into the cool night air. The exhausted crowd erupted into relieved tears. Little Rowan broke free from Agnes's embrace and ran straight toward Tristan and Elara, wrapping both arms around them at once. "Don't leave each other again," he whispered. Neither parent answered. They simply held him while sparks drifted upward into the dark sky. Across the courtyard, guards dragged Cedric from behind the burning barn after discovering oil-stained gloves hidden beneath his coat. As the first rays of dawn touched the smoking ruins, Tristan looked from his bound cousin to Elara standing beside the frightened villagers he had nearly destroyed, and understood that exposing the truth before the entire kingdom would be far easier than earning forgiveness from the woman whose faith he had broken with his own hands. Cedric Wycliffe's trial concluded within a fortnight. The evidence against him proved impossible to dispute. Forged letters written by hired scribes, bribed witnesses, falsified estate records, intercepted correspondence, and the attempted murder of innocent villagers through arson left no room for clever speeches or noble privilege. Before judges, landowners, and ordinary farmers alike, he was stripped of every title and sentenced to spend the remainder of his life imprisoned far from the county he had nearly destroyed. The verdict brought relief, yet no celebration echoed through Black Hollow. Justice had arrived, but justice alone could not restore 5 stolen years. Tristan understood that truth had cleared Elara's name, not his own conscience. The morning after the trial, he arrived at Black Hollow before sunrise wearing plain riding clothes instead of ducal finery. Without announcing himself, he walked toward the fields where laborers were already preparing the spring planting. Several farmers exchanged uncertain glances as the Duke removed his coat, accepted a shovel, and quietly joined them in repairing an irrigation channel damaged by winter storms. He worked until his hands blistered beneath unfamiliar labor. No speeches followed. No servant praised him. At sunset he mounted his horse and rode home without asking to see Elara. The next morning he returned. Then the morning after that. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Every visit followed the same pattern. He repaired fences broken by heavy winds, replaced rotting beams inside cottages belonging to elderly widows, carried sacks of grain into storage barns, and helped stable hands shoe rescued horses. He accepted every difficult task offered to him without reminding anyone he had once commanded great halls filled with servants. The villagers watched cautiously at first, waiting for pride to return. Instead they saw quiet perseverance. Rowan noticed before anyone else. The little boy found Tristan mending a wooden gate one afternoon and settled beside him with a handful of nails far too large for his small fingers. "You hit the hammer sideways," Rowan observed with complete seriousness. Tristan laughed despite himself. "I believe you're right. My mother says wood remembers kindness." Tristan looked up. "Does it?" Rowan nodded confidently. "If you rush, it breaks." The simple words lingered long after the gate stood repaired. Soon Rowan insisted on helping the Duke with every chore. Together they gathered eggs before breakfast, carried buckets to thirsty horses, planted vegetable seedlings beside the greenhouse, and built tiny birdhouses from leftover timber. Tristan discovered that the boy asked endless questions about stars, rivers, trees, and every unusual insect hidden beneath stones. He answered each patiently, surprised by how naturally conversation flowed between them. Some evenings Rowan climbed onto a fence after finishing his work and proudly announced every new accomplishment to his mother before racing toward the orchard with laughter carried by the wind. Elara watched these moments carefully. She neither encouraged nor discouraged them. Trust, once broken, could not be hurried. She accepted Tristan's help exactly as she accepted everyone else's, with gratitude for honest work and silence toward old promises. Sometimes they worked side by side for hours planting fruit trees or sorting grain without exchanging more than a few practical words. Yet those quiet hours slowly became less painful. Shared purpose succeeded where explanations had failed. Spring yielded to summer. The rebuilt grain barn stood stronger than before, its heavy oak beams carved by local craftsmen determined never again to surrender to flames. Tristan worked among them from the first foundation stone until the final slate settled upon the roof. When the barn doors opened for the first harvest, the villagers applauded not because a duke had paid for its construction but because he had carried timber beside them like any ordinary laborer. Mrs. Agnes Rowan watched from beneath the shade of an old apple tree. "You've learned something valuable," she said one afternoon. Tristan smiled faintly. "I've learned many things." She shook her head. "No." Her weathered eyes rested gently upon him. "You've finally learned to listen." Those words humbled him more deeply than any public accusation. As harvest season approached, Black Hollow welcomed more visitors than ever before. Farmers traveled from distant counties hoping to study Elara's orchards, irrigation methods, and charitable schools. Widows came seeking honest employment rather than pity. Orphans found warm meals and patient teachers. The estate no longer symbolized survival alone. It had become a place where people discovered new beginnings. Elara refused to profit from their hardship. Every spring and autumn she organized great gatherings where struggling families received sacks of grain, young fruit trees, healthy livestock, seeds, blankets, and sturdy tools without charge. Wealthy landowners quietly began donating supplies after witnessing her generosity. Even neighboring nobles who once dismissed Black Hollow as cursed now praised its example throughout Parliament. One crisp autumn morning, invitations spread across the entire county requesting every resident to gather at the estate gates. Curiosity filled the valley. Villagers arrived carrying children upon their shoulders. Farmers left fields unattended. Merchants closed shops. Noble families stood beside shepherds without ceremony. The broken iron gates that had once witnessed exile now stood fully restored, though their original rusted lock remained carefully preserved upon one weathered stone pillar. Elara arrived believing another charitable festival had been planned. Instead she found Tristan waiting alone before the entrance. He wore no ceremonial robes. No jeweled chain rested across his shoulders. Only a simple dark coat and the expression of a man who had spent many sleepless nights searching for words impossible to perfect. In his hands rested two objects. The first was her wedding ring. The second was the rusted iron key. Without hesitation, Tristan stepped forward and slowly knelt upon the very ground where her carriage had disappeared 5 years earlier. Silence spread across the gathering. No one moved. No one spoke. The Duke lowered his head. "I gave you ruins," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the still morning air. "You built a home." He lifted the old key. "I believed lies because they demanded less courage than trust." Then he held out the ring. "I judged the woman who loved me without allowing her truth to be heard. I cannot reclaim the years I stole from you. I cannot erase the fear you carried, the nights you spent alone, or the childhood our son deserved to share with both his parents." His eyes met hers at last. "So I will not ask you to forget." A tear slipped unnoticed down his cheek. "I ask only for the chance to spend whatever years remain proving that the man who abandoned you no longer exists." The valley remained utterly silent. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt. Elara looked at the ring for a long moment before gently closing Tristan's fingers around it. Then she turned away. Many watching believed she had rejected him forever. Tristan rose slowly without protest. He neither called after her nor begged for another answer. He simply placed the ring safely inside his pocket and returned to helping unload wagons filled with seed grain for poor farmers, working until sunset exactly as he had every other day. Life continued. Winter covered the orchards with quiet snow. Together they repaired damaged roofs after heavy storms. Together they distributed firewood to isolated cottages. Together they comforted families struck by illness. Still Elara offered no promise. Yet she no longer stepped away when Tristan approached. She no longer avoided his eyes. Sometimes Rowan laughed between them while building snowmen beside the manor, and for a fleeting instant they resembled the family fate had once intended them to become. When spring finally returned, thousands gathered for Black Hollow's festival of new beginnings. Wagons overflowing with seeds, fruit trees, livestock, farming tools, and books lined the courtyard. Widows received dairy cows. Young couples received saplings for their first orchards. Orphans carried away warm clothing sewn during winter evenings by village volunteers. Music floated across blooming fields while children danced beneath flowering apple trees planted years earlier by Elara's own hands. As the celebration drew toward its close, Rowan ran excitedly toward his mother carrying something wrapped in a small linen cloth. "I found this," he said. He carefully unfolded the fabric. Inside rested the wedding ring. Elara looked toward Tristan. He had not placed it there. Rowan smiled innocently. "It belongs with our family." For the first time in many years, Elara's guarded expression softened completely. She accepted the ring with trembling fingers before quietly sliding it onto her hand. No grand announcement followed. No cheers interrupted the peaceful afternoon. Tristan simply closed his eyes for a single grateful moment. Later that evening, Rowan stood before the restored gates holding the same rusted key that had once marked his mother's exile. His parents stood beside him beneath arching apple branches heavy with blossoms. Laughing children raced through orchards beyond the entrance while farmers, widows, and neighbors filled the estate with joyful voices. Rowan carefully unlocked the gates, pushed them wide open, looked up at both of his parents and smiled. "Home should never be cursed again," he whispered. Hand in hand, they stepped forward together into the life they had rebuilt, not because suffering had been forgotten, but because forgiveness, steadfast love, and countless acts of quiet kindness had transformed the darkest chapter of their lives into a legacy that would bloom for generations yet to come.